Have you ever stopped to help a stranger and wondered if that single act could change your entire life? Grace Parker, a hardworking black woman juggling 2 jobs, wasn't looking for miracles, only a little peace at the end of a long day. But one rainy night, she found an old man sitting alone at a deserted bus stop, soaked and shivering. Everyone else walked past him. Grace didn't. She offered him a warm meal and a place to rest, never knowing that this lonely old man was the father of one of the most powerful billionaires in the city. That simple act of kindness pulled her into a world she never imagined, a world of wealth, suspicion, and impossible choices. When generosity meets greed, when truth collides with power, Grace must decide what truly defines her circumstances, or her heart. If it were you, what would you do? Would you still choose kindness when the world seems to punish good people? Would you still believe in love when everything you built is tested by fire? This is a story about how one selfless act can change the course of destiny, about how compassion can build bridges between souls who have nothing in common but the need to be seen. Join us in this unforgettable journey. Black woman shares meals with lonely old man, unaware his son is a famous billionaire. If you believe kindness still matters, like, share, and subscribe now. And let's begin this story together. The evening lights of Maplewood flickered like old memories, soft, trembling, almost shy. A chill wind swept through the narrow streets, carrying the scent of rain and fried food from the corner diner. It was nearly 10 when Grace Parker locked the restaurant door and stepped out, her apron still smelling of coffee and bacon grease. She'd just finished another 12-hour shift. Her feet ached. Her paycheck, folded inside her pocket, felt lighter than the weight of her tired heart. Grace was 33, living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment on Elm Street. Every day was a loop. Wake up, work, survive. But even in her exhaustion, she had a ritual. She never skipped sharing a meal with someone who had none. As she walked past the bus stop under the yellow streetlight, she noticed a figure hunched over the bench. An old man, thin as a reed, his coat soaked, his hands trembling around an empty paper cup. His shoes were mismatched, one brown, one gray. He looked lost, not just in place but in time. Grace hesitated. She'd been warned enough times. Don't talk to strangers at night. Grace. But something about him drew her closer. The quiet dignity beneath the dirt and wrinkles. She knelt down gently. "Sir, are you okay?" The man lifted his face slowly. His eyes were pale blue, cloudy like winter glass. I'm not sure where I am anymore," he murmured. His voice cracked like paper. Grace smiled softly, the kind of smile that made people believe her even when life had broken her, too. "Well, you're in Maplewood," she said, "and it's freezing out here. Have you eaten tonight?" He shook his head. Grace opened the takeout bag she'd carried from the diner. Inside was her leftover dinner chicken sandwich, fries, and half a slice of apple pie. She handed it to him without thinking. "You should eat this," she said. The man blinked, confused. "But that's your dinner." Grace shrugged. "I can always eat toast when I get home." He looked at the sandwich like it was gold. Then, with trembling fingers, he took a bite. Tears gathered in his eyes before he even swallowed. "This tastes like home," he whispered. "My boy used to love apple pie. Said it was the taste of Sunday afternoons." Grace chuckled softly. "Sounds like your boy's got good taste." The man smiled faintly. "He did. Or maybe he still does. I can't quite remember the last time I saw him." Something in that line tugged at Grace's heart. She sat beside him on the bench, the rain misting softly around them. Cars passed, tires hissing against wet asphalt. "You don't remember where you live?" she asked. He shook his head again. "I was on a bus, maybe from downtown. Then everything got blurry." He pressed his fingers to his temples. "I think I fell asleep. And when I woke up, I was here." Grace looked at him quietly. His clothes were fine, once wool coat, polished buttons, but now they were worn, edges frayed. He didn't look like the usual homeless folks she met. Maybe, she thought, he'd lost his way more than his home. She took a breath. "My name's Grace Parker. What's yours?" He hesitated, then said, almost unsure, Henry Caldwell." The name rolled off his tongue like something old and fragile. Grace offered her hand. "Nice to meet you. Mr. Caldwell. Let's get you somewhere warm." "Huh?" He looked startled. "Oh, no. I don't want to trouble you." "You won't," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You'll freeze out here." He stared at her for a moment, measuring the sincerity in her tired face. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "Just for tonight." They walked together through the drizzle. The street lights cast long shadows on the cracked sidewalk. Every few steps, Henry coughed, the sound sharp in the quiet air. Grace slowed down so he could keep up. When they reached her apartment, she fumbled for the keys, a little nervous. It wasn't much, a small kitchen, one sofa, and a faded rug, but it was warm. "Here," she said, helping him to the sofa. "You can rest here while I grab you something dry." Henry sank into the cushions like a child sinking into a story. He looked around, eyes softening. "It's cozy. Feels safe." Grace smiled. "It's not fancy, but it's mine." She handed him a blanket, then poured him a mug of instant cocoa. Henry cupped it carefully, steam curling around his wrinkled fingers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The clock ticked. Outside, the rain turned to snow, brushing the window in slow, graceful strokes. "You live alone?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," Grace replied. "Just me and a radio that never shuts up." Henry chuckled, the first sound of warmth in his voice. "Sometimes silence is louder." "Though?" She nodded. "Yeah, I know that too well." He took another sip, then whispered, "You remind me of my late wife. She always made cocoa when things felt too heavy." Grace's throat tightened. "You miss her every day." They sat in silence again, two souls stitched together by loneliness and chance. Then Henry said something that would stay with Grace for a long time. "You know," he murmured, staring at the window, "kindness like yours, it doesn't show up often anymore." Grace didn't answer. She only smiled faintly and pulled the blanket higher over his shoulders as he drifted to sleep. She looked at his face in the dim light, peaceful now, though still fragile. Somewhere deep inside, something whispered, "This man isn't just lost. He's been forgotten." Grace turned off the lamp and whispered to the quiet room, "You're safe now. Mr. Caldwell, you're safe. Outside." Maplewood's lights shimmered against the snowfall, and for the first time in a long while, Grace Parker didn't feel entirely alone. Morning light crept through the blinds, drawing faint golden lines across the small apartment. The sound of the radiator hissed softly, like an old man's sigh. Grace stood by the stove, stirring oatmeal in a dented pot. She glanced over her shoulder to where Henry Caldwell still slept on the sofa, covered with the blanket she had tucked around him last night. For a moment, she simply watched him. His breathing was slow, his face peaceful. But there was a sadness there, too, something that lingered, even in rest. She wondered what his story was, who he had been before the streets had taken him. When the oatmeal was done, she poured it into 2 bowls and set one on the small coffee table beside him. The steam curled up gently. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice soft. "Breakfast ready." Henry stirred, blinking in confusion before focusing on her face. "Oh, good morning, Miss Parker," he murmured. "I'm afraid I don't remember falling asleep." "You were exhausted," Grace said. No surprise there. He struggled to sit up, and she helped him, steadying his shoulders. "I haven't had someone make me breakfast in a long time," he said, looking at the oatmeal as though it were something sacred. "Well," Grace smiled, "there's a first time for everything." He smiled back, faintly. "It's been so long since I've had a home-cooked meal. Not since my wife passed." Grace hesitated, sensing the weight behind his words. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He nodded, spooning the oatmeal slowly. "We had a small house once. She'd hum in the kitchen every morning. Same song, over and over." He chuckled softly. "I can't remember the name of it now, but I can still hear her voice." Grace sat across from him, eating in silence. There was comfort in the quiet between them two people who didn't owe each other anything, yet shared the same space like it had always belonged to both. When breakfast was done, she cleared the dishes. "Do you remember where you live?" she asked gently. Henry frowned, thinking hard. "I remember a gate, black iron, a big garden, but I don't recall the address. Do you have any family I could call, maybe a son or daughter?" He paused, searching his memory. "A son, yes. His name." He pressed his fingers to his forehead. "Ethan Caldwell. But we haven't spoken in years." Grace froze for a second. The name sounded oddly familiar. Then it came to her something she'd heard on the diner's old TV the night before. The newscaster's voice echoed in her memory. Billionaire entrepreneur Ethan Caldwell makes headlines again as search continues for his missing father. Henry Caldwell, last seen near Lakeview Station. Grace's stomach tightened. She looked at the man sitting on her sofa, the same name, the same frail figure, the lost eyes. Could it be him? But how could she be sure? She turned back toward him, trying to keep her tone calm. "Did you say Ethan Caldwell?" "Yes," Henry said, nodding slowly. "He's a busy man. Always was. I suppose he has no time for old men who forget things." Grace smiled gently, though her heart raced. "Maybe he's just worried about you." He gave a weary laugh. "If he is, it'd be the first time in a long while." Grace thought about calling the police, but she hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if this man wasn't the same Henry Caldwell? Or worse, what if the police thought she'd done something wrong by bringing him here? She'd seen it happen before, people trying to help, and somehow still getting blamed. "Maybe I should call someone," she murmured. Henry looked up sharply, panic flickering in his eyes. "Please, no police," he said. "I don't want any trouble." Grace softened her voice. "It's okay. I just want to make sure you're safe." "I'm fine here," he insisted. "I'll rest a bit, and then I'll be on my way. You've done more than enough." Grace sighed. "Mr. Caldwell, you can stay until you figure things out." "I don't mind." He looked at her with quiet disbelief. "You don't even know me, Miss Parker?" Grace shrugged. "Sometimes that's exactly why people help. No expectations, just kindness." For a moment, he didn't answer. Then his eyes shimmered with something that wasn't quite tears, but close. "You remind me of her again," he said softly. "My wife. She believed in people, too." Grace smiled faintly and changed the subject. "You can rest while I'm at work. The extra blanket's in the closet. There's food in the fridge, though it's mostly leftovers." "Thank you," he whispered. She glanced at the clock. "I have to leave soon. Lock the door from the inside." "Okay, just slide the bolt." Henry nodded, watching her gather her bag and coat. "You've got a good heart. Grace Parker. Don't let the world harden it." She paused at the door, looking back at him. "Guess I'll take that as a blessing." Then she left, stepping into the cold morning air, on her way to work. The thought gnawed at her. The name, the way he spoke, the details, everything pointed to the same man from the news. But she couldn't wrap her head around it. What was a billionaire's father doing lost in her neighborhood, dressed like he'd been wandering for weeks? The world was full of stories like that, people forgotten by their own families, wealth that couldn't buy love or time. Grace had seen enough of both to know money couldn't fill the cracks life left behind. When she reached the diner, the TV above the counter was on again. The same anchor, the same story. Still no sign of Henry Caldwell. "Father of tech mogul Ethan Caldwell," the woman reported. "Authorities urge anyone with information to come forward." Grace's breath caught in her throat. There was no mistake now. It was him. The man sleeping on her sofa was the father of one of the richest men in the country. She stared at the screen, oatmeal spoon frozen halfway to her mouth. What was she supposed to do now if she called the police? They'd swarm her tiny apartment. If she said nothing, and someone found out later, she could be accused of hiding him. She exhaled slowly, her heart pounding. Back at the apartment, Henry Caldwell slept peacefully, unaware that his quiet refuge was about to become the center of something far bigger than either of them could imagine. Grace didn't know it yet, but this small act of kindness, the simple choice to share her meal, was about to change the course of both their lives. And when the truth came knocking, nothing in her quiet little world would ever be the same again. The rain returned that afternoon, soft but steady, tapping against the diner's windows like a quiet reminder that some things never stop. Grace wiped the counter absent-mindedly, her mind drifting back to the small apartment on Elm Street, to the man she'd left there sleeping. Every few minutes she'd catch herself glancing at the clock. She hadn't told anyone about Henry. She wasn't sure why, maybe because once the world knew, something good and fragile would be taken away. The bell above the diner door jingled, and the smell of wet coats filled the air. Customers came in shaking off umbrellas, laughing about traffic. The TV above the counter was turned low, just enough for Grace to hear snippets of the noon news. "Authorities continue their search for Henry Caldwell," the reporter said. "Father of tech billionaire Ethan Caldwell, missing since Tuesday morning." Grace froze mid-wipe. The photo on the screen was sharper now, a younger Henry, maybe from 5 years ago, in a tailored suit and blue tie. The resemblance was unmistakable. Her coworker, Dana, followed her gaze. "That poor old guy," she said. "Imagine being rich and still losing your own father. Money can't fix that." Grace nodded weakly. "Yeah, guess it can't." Her heart pounded. The old man in her apartment wasn't just lost. He was that Henry Caldwell. Every instinct told her to do something. Call someone. Tell the truth. But another part of her, the quieter, more cautious side, hesitated. People didn't always listen to women like her, especially not black women from working neighborhoods. If she called the police and they misunderstood, if they thought she was hiding him on purpose. She'd seen how stories twisted on the news, how quick they were to paint a villain. She remembered her mother's voice, Grace. The world don't always see you for your heart. You got to be careful who you trust. The thought made her throat tighten. She grabbed her coat from the hook and told Dana she'd take her break early. Outside, the sky hung low, heavy with rain. She pulled her hood up and walked fast, heart hammering, shoes splashing through puddles. The streets were quiet except for the sound of water and the hum of distant traffic. When she reached her building, she fumbled with the keys, nervous for reasons she couldn't name. Inside, the apartment was dim. The air smelled faintly of cocoa and soap. Henry sat on the sofa, awake now. The blanket folded neatly beside him. He was staring at a small photo frame Grace kept on her shelf, a picture of her mother smiling beside a little girl with braids. "She looks kind," Henry said softly. "Your mother." Grace nodded, closing the door behind her. "Yeah, she passed when I was 16. Henry turned the photo slightly, catching the light. "You have her smile." Grace felt a pang in her chest. People say that. He looked up, studying her face. "You've been worrying," he said. "I can see it in your eyes. Did something happen?" Grace hesitated. "I saw the news today. They're looking for you. Mr. Caldwell. Your son Ethan. He's been trying to find you." Henry frowned, as though the name hurt to hear. "He's looking for me." "Yes," Grace said. "They said you've been missing for days. Everyone's talking about it." Henry rubbed his temples, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want any of this." Grace sat down beside him. "Mr. Caldwell, I think you need to let them know you're safe. They're worried." He shook his head, trembling. "You don't understand. My son, he doesn't see me. Not really. I was just a burden, something to be managed. When my wife died, I became invisible in that house." Grace watched him, torn between compassion and confusion. "Still, he's your family." He smiled bitterly. "Family's not always about blood. Grace. Sometimes it's about who stays when the lights go out." The words hit her deeper than she expected. She knew what it meant to be forgotten, to live a life that passed quietly between other people's priorities. A clap of thunder rolled outside, shaking the window pane. Grace leaned forward. "Maybe he's changed. Maybe he just needs to see you." Henry's eyes clouded. "And what then? He'll send me to some private clinic. Out of sight. Out of mind." "No. Thank you." Grace sighed, looking at her hands. "So what do you want me to do?" "Nothing," he said gently. "You've done enough already." But Grace couldn't rest easy with that. She stood up and walked to the small window, watching the rain slide down the glass like threads of silver. Somewhere out there, she thought, was a man searching for his father, and a father too proud or too hurt to be found. She turned back toward him. "I'll give you tonight," she said. "But tomorrow, we'll figure this out together." "Deal." Henry met her eyes, a flicker of trust there now. "Deal." He looked tired again, his body small against the worn sofa. Grace made him tea, the steam rising between them. "Do you know," he said suddenly, "when you handed me that sandwich last night, I almost didn't take it. I was ashamed. A man like me once had everything, now begging for scraps from a stranger." Grace stirred her own cup. "You weren't begging. I offered. There's a difference." He smiled faintly. "You have a way of seeing people as they could be, not just what they are." "Guess that's the only way I know how," she replied softly. The room settled into a quiet rhythm again. The rain, the clink of mugs, the heartbeat of something unspoken growing between them. Respect, maybe, or understanding. Later that night, as Henry drifted to sleep, Grace sat at the small table, staring at her old laptop. She typed Ethan Caldwell into the search bar. Articles filled the screen. Tech genius, visionary, billionaire philanthropist, in photo after photo. Ethan's confident smile glowed beside world leaders and celebrities. But in one picture, an older one, his arm was around a woman and an older man. Grace zoomed in. Henry Caldwell, healthy and happy, stood there beside his son. Her chest tightened. She glanced toward the sofa, where the same man now slept in her apartment, unaware of the storm his disappearance had caused. Grace closed the laptop slowly, the rain still whispering against the window. Something inside her told her the peace of this small apartment wouldn't last much longer. Tomorrow would bring decisions, and whatever she chose, it would change everything. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of day that felt half asleep even at 8 o'clock. The rain had stopped, but the streets of Maplewood still glistened, puddles shining like tiny mirrors. Grace wrapped herself in her worn coat and hurried toward the bus stop. She planned to pick up a few groceries before her shift, maybe some medicine for Henry's cough. She moved fast, her mind crowded with questions she couldn't answer. Should she call someone today? Should she tell the police? Would they believe she was only trying to help? The thought of flashing lights and strangers in her apartment made her uneasy. By the time she reached the corner store, her hands were cold and her nerves raw. She grabbed soup cans, cough syrup, and a loaf of bread. The clerk, an older woman named Mrs. Alvarez, smiled kindly. "You working too much again?" Grace forced a small laugh. "Guess I don't know how not to. Be careful." "Mija," the woman said, "you always give. One day, you'll forget to keep a little for yourself." Grace nodded and thanked her, but the words stuck in her chest. She was still thinking about them. She crossed the street toward her building. Halfway up the stairs, she heard voices, a deep male voice, sharp, demanding, and another, softer, frightened. Grace froze. Her heart started to race. When she reached her floor, the apartment door was wide open. A man in a dark suit stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, and angry. His hair was neatly styled, his expression cold and impatient. 2 uniformed officers flanked him. Henry sat on the sofa, confused and trembling. Grace's groceries slipped from her hands, a can rolling across the floor. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man turned toward her, eyes narrowing. "Are you Grace Parker?" "Yes." "Who are you?" "I'm Ethan Caldwell," he said flatly. "And that man you've been keeping here is my father." The words hit like a slap. Grace stared at him, stunned. "Keeping here, I wasn't keeping anyone. He was lost. I was helping him." Ethan stepped closer, anger sharp in his voice. "Helping you took him off the street and didn't report it. My father's been missing for days. The police have been searching nonstop." Grace shook her head, backing away. "I didn't even know who he was until yesterday." "I was going to save it," Ethan snapped. "Do you know how this looks? A stranger with my father, hidden in some rundown apartment." Henry tried to speak. "Ethan, please, she didn't do anything wrong." But Ethan didn't listen. His face hardened, voice rising. "You don't understand. Dad, people like her see a chance and take it." The words hung in the air like poison. Grace's breath caught. People like her. Her hands trembled. "You don't even know me," she said quietly. "All I did was feed him and give him a place to sleep." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You expect me to believe that the officers exchanged uneasy glances?" Henry stood up shakily, his frail hands gripping the arm of the sofa. "Ethan, stop this. She saved me." But Ethan's fury burned too bright to hear reason. "Enough," he said, motioning toward the police. "Do your job." One of the officers, the younger one, hesitated. "Sir, we're not sure she's committed any arrest, her," Ethan demanded. "For unlawful detainment, trespassing, whatever applies. She kept him here without contacting anyone." Grace stepped back, her chest tightening. "I didn't detain him. He wanted to stay. He was sick and cold." Ethan glared at her, his voice cutting through the air. "You think I'm stupid? You probably plan to extort money." Grace's eyes widened. "Money I can barely afford rent." The tension in the room thickened. The older officer finally moved forward, his tone calm. "Ma'am, we just need to ask you a few questions downtown." Grace swallowed hard, glancing at Henry. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'll tell them everything." Henry's eyes filled with tears. "I won't let this happen." But before he could do more, Ethan gently pulled him back. "Dad, please, let them handle it." Grace turned to the officers, her voice steady despite her fear. "I didn't do anything wrong. I only tried to help." They let her out, the hallway suddenly too quiet. Outside, neighbors peeked through cracked doors. Whispers followed her down the stairwell like shadows. On the sidewalk, cold rain began to fall again, soaking her hair and jacket. The police car door closed with a heavy thud, echoing like judgment. Through the window, she saw Henry watching from her apartment window, his hand pressed against the glass. He looked small, broken, helpless. At that moment, Grace felt a deep ache she couldn't name, not just fear or shame, but something heavier. Betrayal, maybe. The pain of realizing that doing good didn't always mean being seen as good. At the station, the bright lights felt harsh after the gray of Maplewood. The officers treated her politely, but distant, as if unsure what to make of her. She told them everything, how she'd found Henry at the bus stop, how he was disoriented and cold, how she had fed and sheltered him. One of them, Officer Riley Thompson, seemed to listen closely. "You didn't ask for anything in return?" he asked. "No?" she said. "Not a thing." He nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "Okay, for what it's worth. I believe you, but we'll need to verify everything." Grace nodded silently. Hours later, when they released her on account of further review, she stepped back into the rain. The city lights blurry through tears she hadn't realized were falling. Her small act of kindness had turned into a storm she couldn't control. And as she walked home, past the same flickering streetlights of Maplewood, she wondered if she'd made a mistake by ever stopping at that bus stop. But even through the fear and humiliation, a small voice inside her whispered something else, something quiet but unshakable. "You did the right thing." She clung to that thought like a thread of light in the dark. At the Caldwell estate across town, Ethan sat in his study, staring at a glass of scotch he hadn't touched. His father was safe, but his conscience was not. Somewhere deep inside, a seed of doubt began to take root. The fluorescent lights in the small gray room hummed softly. Grace sat at the metal table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The walls felt too close, the air too cold. A single camera blinked in the corner, its red light steady and watchful. Across from her sat Officer Riley Thompson, calm but unreadable. He had a notepad in front of him, though he barely glanced at it. "Grace," he began gently, "I just want to go over your statement again. You said you met Mr. Caldwell near the bus stop on Maplewood, around 10 that night." "Yes," Grace replied quietly. "He was sitting on a bench. He looked lost and hungry." Riley nodded. "And you invited him back to your apartment." "I offered him food," she said, her voice steady now. "Then when I realized he had nowhere to go, I let him sleep on my couch. That's all." He studied her for a long moment. "You didn't try to contact anyone?" Grace hesitated. "No, not that night." He was confused, scared. "I thought calling the police might make it worse." "Why's that?" Grace looked down at her hands. "Because sometimes good intentions don't matter when people make assumptions. I didn't want him to be treated like some criminal or tossed into a shelter before we knew what was going on." Riley leaned back, thoughtful. "So you kept him there to protect him." "I kept him there because he was a person in trouble," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Because if I'd walked away, I wouldn't have slept that night." He nodded slowly, writing something down. "You're a good person, Grace. But you can see why Mr. Caldwell's son might have reacted the way he did." "Right." Her jaw tightened. "He saw what he wanted to see." Riley gave a half smile, not unkindly. "Yeah, I guess that's something we all do." He flipped a page in his notebook. "Tell me, did you know who Henry Caldwell was before the news report?" "No." Grace said firmly, "I didn't even know his last name until he told me." Riley scribbled again. Then he closed his notebook. "All right. I think that's all I need for now." Grace looked up, startled. "That's it?" "Yeah," he said. "You're free to go. For now." She blinked. "So, I'm not being charged?" Riley shook his head. "Not unless something changes? But don't leave town. And Grace?" She paused by the door. "For what it's worth," he said softly, "I believe you. Sometimes people help because it's the right thing to do. The world just forgets that." Grace gave a small, tired smile. "Thank you, officer." When she stepped outside, the afternoon light felt almost blinding. Her knees wobbled as she walked down the steps, the weight of the last 24 hours pressing hard on her shoulders. She didn't know where to go. Home felt invaded now, violated by suspicion and harsh words. Still, she went there anyway. As she reached her building, she saw something unexpected. A sleek black car parked in front. A man in a suit stood beside it, talking on his phone. It was Ethan Caldwell. Grace froze on the sidewalk. For a moment, she thought about turning around, disappearing down another street. But before she could move, Ethan looked up and saw her. Their eyes met. His expression softened barely, but it was enough to make her stop. He ended the call and walked toward her, his expensive shoes splashing through a shallow puddle. "Grace," he said quietly, "can we talk?" She hesitated. "You've done enough talking, Mr. Caldwell." "I know," he said, voice low. "I said things I shouldn't have." Grace crossed her arms, trying to hide how much her hands trembled. "You accused me of kidnapping your father." "I was scared," he said. "He's all I have left. When I saw him there, in a stranger's apartment. In a stranger's apartment, because that stranger took him in when everyone else walked by." Grace interrupted. "Because that stranger didn't look at him like a problem." Ethan's gaze fell to the ground. "You're right. I misjudged you." "Misjudged," she repeated bitterly. "You called the police on me." He sighed. I can't undo that, but I want to make it right." Grace studied him. He looked different now, less polished, more human. The sharpness in his eyes had dulled into guilt. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "I want to thank you," he said simply, "and I want to apologize to you and my father." Grace didn't answer. She turned toward the building. "He's inside." Ethan nodded. "He asked for you." The words made her pause. Against her better judgment, she followed him inside. Henry sat at her small kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming in front of him. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "Grace," he said, smiling softly. "You came back." She managed a small smile. "I always keep my word. Mr. Caldwell." Ethan stood near the door, watching silently as his father reached for Grace's hand. "You see," Ethan Henry said, his voice trembling, "this is the woman who helped me when no one else did. She didn't ask for anything. She just cared." Ethan's throat tightened. "I know, Dad. I know that now." Henry turned to Grace again. "You've got a good heart. I told him that last night. I told him the world needs more people like you." Grace blinked back tears. "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not," Henry said. "But gratitude doesn't need to be owed. It's given." Ethan stepped forward, his tone softer than before. "I want to help you, Grace, however I can." Grace shook her head. "I don't need money." He smiled faintly. "I wasn't offering money. I was offering a chance. You said you work at the Maplewood diner, right? My company partners with community programs, housing, education, small business grants. If you ever want something more than this life, I can help." Grace hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no immediately, to reject anything that came from him. But another part, the one that had spent years scraping by, recognized an open door when she saw it. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "That's all I ask." Henry smiled, his eyes warm. "See? Good things find their way back. Grace, always." For the first time in days, she felt her chest loosen. Maybe not everything was broken. That night, after they left, Grace sat by her window. The street outside was quiet again, the rain gone, the air cool. She thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the anger, the misunderstandings, and how one small act of kindness had rippled through all of it. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this. She wouldn't stop doing good just because someone mistook it for something else. Because in a world that too often looked away, choosing to see someone to really see them was the most radical act of all. The following week felt strangely quiet. The noise of everything that had happened, the police, the confrontation, the apologies had faded into a hush that Grace didn't quite trust. The diner returned to its usual rhythm, the hiss of the griddle, the hum of conversation, the smell of coffee that clung to everything. But inside, she felt different, like something in her had shifted, though she couldn't yet name it. On Wednesday evening, the bell above the door chimed softly. Grace looked up from behind the counter and froze. Standing there, dressed in a gray wool coat and a gentle smile, was Henry Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, surprised. "You shouldn't be walking around in this cold." Henry chuckled. "My doctor says walking's good for the heart. Besides, I had a reason to come." Grace poured him a cup of coffee automatically, her hands remembering the routine, even while her mind was racing. "You didn't have to come all the way here. How are you feeling better?" he said, settling onto a stool. "The doctors say I just need rest and less stress. But I told them peace of mind doesn't come from bed rest. It comes from doing the right thing." Grace smiled faintly. You sound like my mother." "Then she must have been a wise woman," Henry said. For a moment, they sat quietly. Grace noticed how his color had returned, how his voice carried more strength now. He looked healthier, sharper, as if finding his way back home had brought him back to himself. Then he slid a small envelope across the counter. "This is for you," he said. Grace frowned, wiping her hands on a towel before picking it up. Inside was a cream-colored invitation card with embossed lettering. "The Caldwell Foundation Charity Gala, hosted by Ethan Caldwell. In appreciation of the community kindness." She looked up, confused. "What is this?" Henry smiled softly. "Ethan's hosting a dinner this Friday. He wanted to honor those who make a difference in quiet ways. He asked me who should be there, and you said me. I insisted." Henry said, eyes warm. "You don't have to come if you don't want to, but I'd like you to. It would mean a lot to me." Grace hesitated. She'd never been to anything close to a gala. The words charity dinner alone made her feel out of place. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't think I belong in a room like that." "Grace," Henry said gently, "you belong anywhere. Kindness is recognized." She couldn't help but smile. "You've got a way with words." You know that he grinned. Age gives you plenty of practice. Later that night, Grace sat in her apartment staring at the invitation. The gold lettering shimmered under the lamp. Elegant and intimidating. She thought about turning it down, about saving herself the awkwardness of walking into a room full of people who'd probably see her as a charity case. But then she remembered what Henry had said. You belong anywhere. Kindness is recognized. By Friday evening, she found herself standing in front of a grand building in downtown Maplewood, the Caldwell Center for Innovation. The air smelled faintly of roses and rain, the marble steps glistening under the city lights. Grace had borrowed a simple navy blue dress from her coworker Dana. It fit well enough, though she tugged at the hem nervously as she approached the doors. Her reflection in the glass looked almost unfamiliar polished, composed, though still undeniably her. Inside, the lobby sparkled with chandeliers. The sound of music drifted from the ballroom's soft jazz and murmurs of laughter. Grace hesitated at the edge of the crowd until she spotted Henry across the room. He waved her over, his face lighting up like a proud grandfather's. "You made it," he said, taking her hands. "You look wonderful." Grace blushed. "You're too kind." "I'm just honest," he said with a wink. Then Ethan appeared beside him, looking different from the last time she'd seen him. The sharpness was gone from his features. He looked humbled, sincere. "Grace," he said quietly, "I'm really glad you came." She nodded, unsure how to reply. Ethan continued, "I owe you more than an apology. My father. He told me what you did for him, and he told me what kind of person you are. I can't undo how I reacted, but I can start making things right." He gestured toward the stage at the far end of the room. "Would you join us up there when we speak?" Grace blinked. "Up there in front of everyone." Henry chuckled. "Don't worry. You won't have to make a speech. Just stand with us. People should see who kindness really looks like." Reluctantly, she agreed. As the evening went on, the music softened, and Ethan took the stage. Cameras flashed, people quieted, and his voice carried through the room. "Tonight," he began, "is not about wealth or success. It's about humanity, the small, simple acts that remind us who we are." He glanced toward Grace and smiled. "A week ago, my father was lost, scared, and a stranger someone who owed him nothing gave him food, shelter, and dignity. That stranger reminded me that compassion isn't weakness, it's strength. The audience murmured, touched. Grace felt her face grow warm as eyes turned toward her. Ethan continued, "Her name is Grace Parker, and she reminded my family that kindness still exists, not in grand gestures, but in quiet, everyday courage." Applause filled the room. Grace's eyes stung, tears welling despite herself. Henry reached over and squeezed her hand. When the applause faded, Ethan stepped aside and motioned toward her. "Grace, would you do us the honor of joining our community outreach initiative? The foundation could use someone with your heart." Grace's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Henry whispered, smiling. The crowd chuckled softly, and Grace laughed through her tears. "All right," she said finally. "Yes. Later." As the night wound down and the guests began to leave, Grace found herself standing by the window overlooking the city lights. The streets below shimmered, reflections dancing across wet pavement. Ethan approached quietly. "You were brave tonight," he said. Grace smiled faintly. "I just stood there." He shook his head. "You did more than that. You reminded me of what I'd forgotten." She looked at him for a long moment. "And what's that?" "That people matter more than success," he said softly. "That no amount of money replaces a good heart." Grace looked out at the skyline again, her voice gentle. "Then maybe we both learned something this week." For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the city breathe beneath them. And for the first time in a long while, Grace felt seen not as a waitress or a stranger, but as herself. The Monday after the gala, Grace stood outside the Caldwell Foundation's glass building, clutching a small folder against her chest. The morning sun reflected off the tall windows, turning everything into a glare of light. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind looping through what Ethan had said at the dinner. The foundation could use someone with your heart. It sounded nice when he said it, but now, faced with the reality of this place, the marble floors, the polished brass nameplates, the rows of expensive cars, she felt like an imposter. Inside the lobby, a young woman greeted her with a professional smile. "Good morning. You must be Ms. Parker. Mr. Caldwell is expecting you." Grace nodded, her palms sweating. "Right. Thank you." The elevator ride felt endless. By the time the doors opened on the top floor, her heart was pounding. She stepped out into a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs, charity projects, scholarships, smiling children, rebuilt homes. It was beautiful, but it also made her feel small. When she reached the corner office, Ethan was standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was calm, confident, the kind that filled a room without trying. He turned when he saw her, ending the call quickly. "Grace," he said warmly, "I'm really glad you came." She smiled awkwardly. "I almost didn't. Why not places like this?" she said softly. "They don't usually have room for people like me." Ethan shook his head. "You'd be surprised. We need people like you more than you think." He gestured toward a chair. "Please, sit." Grace did, trying to look composed. "I wanted to talk to you about what I mentioned at the gala." Ethan said, "Our foundation runs several programs: community meals, job training, housing support. We're expanding, but most of what we do stays trapped in boardrooms. People with degrees make plans for people they've never met. That's what I want to change." Grace listened quietly. "I want someone who knows what real life looks like," Ethan continued. "Someone who's lived it. Someone who understands people, not just data. You've done that your whole life. Grace, I think you could help us reach people better. Grace blinked. You mean, you want to hire me? Ethan smiled. That's exactly what I mean. If you're interested. Grace looked down at her hands. The idea was overwhelming. Her whole life had been about survival, long hours at the diner. Bills paid just in time. Dreams postponed because they never seemed practical. Now, suddenly, she was being offered something more. What would I even do here, she asked cautiously. You'd work directly with our outreach team, Ethan said. Visit communities, organize meal programs, listen to what people really need. We can train you on everything else. Grace hesitated. And why me? Because you don't see people as problems to fix, he said softly. You see them as people. That silence stretched between them, warm and heavy. Finally, she said, I'll need time to think. Of course, Ethan replied. Take all the time you need. Just know the door's open. Grace left the office with a swirl of emotions, hope, fear, disbelief. As she stepped out into the city air, she found Henry waiting for her by the fountain in front of the building. He stood leaning on his cane, smiling like he'd known she'd come. So, how did it go? Grace sighed. He offered me a job. Henry's grin widened. And you said yes. Not yet, she admitted. It's a lot. I don't belong in the world. Henry, I'm just a waitress from Maplewood. Henry's eyes softened. Grace, I've met plenty of people from that world. Most of them could use a bit of your honesty and humility. Maybe that's why Ethan needs you there. Grace looked away. What if I fail? Henry chuckled. Then fail trying to do something good. But don't walk away just because you're scared. That night, Grace returned to her small apartment. The hum of the fridge, the faint traffic outside, it all felt different now. She made herself tea and sat at the table, staring at the invitation card from the gala still pinned to her wall. For the first time in a long time, she wondered what her life could be if she stopped settling for less. By morning, her decision was made. She arrived at the Caldwell Foundation just after 9, wearing the same navy dress she'd borrowed from Dana. She walked straight to Ethan's office. I'll take the job, she said. Ethan smiled, genuinely relieved. You won't regret it. I might, she said with a small laugh, but I'll give it a try anyway. He extended his hand. Welcome aboard, Grace Parker. Over the next few weeks. Grace threw herself into the work. She joined the outreach teams, traveling to shelters, small towns, and food banks. She met people whose stories mirrored her own people, trying, failing, and trying again. Her ability to listen made her stand out. The others in the office began to respect her. Even those who doubted her place there slowly changed their minds when they saw how easily people trusted her. But it wasn't all easy. Grace sometimes felt the weight of expectations pressing on her. Meetings filled with jargon left her lost. The world of philanthropy was polished and polite, but underneath, she could sense the same inequality she'd lived with her whole life. One afternoon, she sat alone in the break room, staring at a stack of reports she barely understood. Henry walked in, his cane tapping softly on the tile. You look like someone wrestling a bear, he teased. Grace smiled tiredly, more like 100 pages of budgets. He chuckled, sitting beside her. You're doing fine. Grace. Better than fine. Ethan told me about the food drive you organized last week. Grace shrugged. That was a team effort. Maybe, Henry said. But it takes one person to start a ripple. She glanced at him. "Do you ever wonder if things happen for a reason?" Henry leaned back, eyes distant, all the time. "Maybe I sat on that bench that night because I was supposed to meet you." Grace smiled softly. "And maybe I stopped because I was supposed to meet you." He nodded. "See, the world still has its ways." Later that evening, Ethan called her into his office. He looked tired but pleased. "The board wants you to take the lead on a new pilot program," he said. "Something small community kitchens in low-income neighborhoods. You'd be in charge." Grace blinked. "Me in charge?" "You earned it," he said simply. "You've connected with people better than anyone else here. They trust you." Grace felt a swell of pride mixed with nerves. "I'll do my best." "That's all I ask," Ethan said, smiling. When she left the office, Henry was waiting in the hallway. "How's the view from the top?" "Miss Parker?" he asked playfully. Grace laughed. "Still figuring that out." Henry winked. "You will. You always do." That night, as Grace walked home through the quiet streets of Maplewood, she realized something important life had given her more than she'd ever expected. Not because she'd planned it, but because she'd chosen compassion when it mattered most. The first few months at the Caldwell Foundation passed in a blur. Grace learned how to write proposals, manage meetings, and coordinate with local partners. Every day was a new test of patience, balance, and belief. For the first time, she wasn't just serving food to strangers. She was shaping the way help reached them. Yet, beneath the pride, something else grew quietly. A pressure she couldn't name. Her work hours stretched longer. Her evening faded into paperwork. And the warmth that had once guided her started to feel buried under deadlines and board expectations. One morning, Grace stood by the large conference table, surrounded by people in tailored suits. They spoke in polished tones about budgets, donor targets, and quarterly metrics. Ethan was at the head of the table, poised and focused. He trusted Grace to lead the new community kitchen initiative. But now that the project was underway, she felt the weight of scrutiny. "The numbers look good," said one board member, flipping through the report. "But if we relocate 2 of the planned kitchens to wealthier areas, we could increase visibility. It's better optics for our donors." Grace frowned. "Visibility. These programs aren't about optics. They're about feeding people who can't afford a meal." The woman smiled tightly. "Of course, but perception matters. We need press coverage. Without that, funding dries up." Grace looked to Ethan, hoping for support, but he said nothing. After the meeting, Grace caught up with him in the hallway. "You heard what she said," she began. "They want to move resources away from the people who actually need them." Ethan exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Grace, I know, but sometimes you have to play the game to keep the lights on. If we lose funding, no one gets help." Grace stared at him, disbelief in her voice. "You think charity's a game? I think survival is," Ethan said quietly. "And I've been playing it a long time." The words stung more than she expected. For the rest of the day, she couldn't focus. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, the smiling board members, the glossy reports, Ethan's silence. That night, she stopped by the diner on her walk home. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon hit her like nostalgia. Dana waved from behind the counter. "Look at you," Dana teased. "Miss Big City Foundation lady. Haven't seen you in weeks." Grace laughed softly. "Feels like months." They sat in the corner booth, where Grace used to count her tips after long shifts. "So," Dana said, stirring her tea. "You like it there." Grace hesitated. It's complicated. I believe in the work, but sometimes I feel like they've forgotten what helping really means. Dana raised an eyebrow. And what does it mean? Grace looked out the window, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. It means seeing people, not numbers, not stories for a press release, just people. Dana smiled. Then don't let them change that in you. When Grace finally reached home, she found Henry sitting on her sofa, reading the newspaper. He'd taken to visiting her apartment every few days, always bringing something small a pie, a book, a piece of advice. He looked up as she entered. Rough day. Grace dropped her bag and sighed. You could say that? Tell me. She sat beside him, her voice low. They want to move the kitchens to nicer neighborhoods for publicity. They think feeding the poor isn't good for the brand. Henry frowned, his eyes narrowing. Brand? Is that what compassion is now? Grace shook her head. I tried to argue. Ethan just said it's about survival. I get it. Money keeps the doors open, but it feels wrong. Henry leaned forward, resting his hands on his cane. Grace, you remind me of my wife when you talk like that. She never knew how to compromise her heart. Grace smiled faintly. And how did that work out for her? He chuckled. She changed more people than she ever knew. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Henry added, Sometimes the world tries to turn goodness into business. Don't let them buy your soul. Grace. The next morning, Grace went back to work with a quiet fire in her chest. She spent hours reviewing plans, rerunning numbers, trying to find a way to make it work without losing the mission. When she presented her revised proposal at the next meeting, the board was skeptical. This plan keeps all 6 kitchens in their original communities, she explained. But if we redirect part of our unused advertising budget into local media partnerships, we can still get visibility and impact. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Ethan smiled slightly. That's clever. One of the board members frowned. It's risky. We'd have to trust community outlets instead of national coverage. Grace met his gaze. Maybe it's time we start trusting the people we're supposed to be helping. A few heads nodded, others didn't. But Grace didn't back down. By the end of the meeting, Ethan called for a vote. The motion passed, barely. Afterward, he approached her. You know you just made a lot of enemies in there, right? Grace gave a small, tired smile. I've had tougher rooms. He laughed quietly. I'm starting to think my father's right about you. Grace raised an eyebrow. What's that? That you're the only person who's ever told me no and made me glad I heard it? Grace chuckled, shaking her head. Don't get used to it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Grace stayed late at the office, finalizing documents. The city lights began to glow one by one outside the window. She thought about everything she'd gained, the respect, the opportunities, the chance to do real good, and everything she might lose if she kept fighting the system from within. It was a strange balance, this life between two worlds. But as she looked at the photos on her desk, the community kitchen plans, Henry's smiling face, her mother's old picture, she realized she didn't need to choose one over the other. She could be both a woman who knew what hunger felt like and one who could feed 1,000 others. And for the first time in weeks, Grace Parker allowed herself to feel proud not of her success, but of the courage it took to stay herself while holding the weight of it. 2 months later, the Caldwell Foundation's community kitchens were thriving. Grace had poured herself into the project, and it showed. 6 neighborhoods across Maplewood now had clean, safe places where anyone could walk in, eat a hot meal, and feel seen. It wasn't just food they were serving, it was dignity. The success brought media attention, articles, interviews, even a short TV segment. Suddenly, Grace's name was being mentioned alongside Ethan Caldwell's in news reports about innovative compassion. At first, it felt surreal. She was proud, but also uneasy. Every story seemed to twist the truth a little more. One evening, she sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through an online headline that read, "Ethan Caldwell's Foundation Saves the Poor, led by his miracle hire, Grace Parker." The phrase made her stomach twist. Saves the poor, miracle hire. It made her sound like a token, a decoration in someone else's victory story. The next day, Ethan called her into his office. "You've seen the coverage," he asked, smiling proudly. "I have," Grace said, trying to sound polite. "It's incredible. Grace, donations are pouring in. The board's thrilled. We can expand faster than we thought." Grace hesitated. "It's good news, Ethan, but some of these stories, they make it sound like a PR campaign." Ethan frowned slightly. "That's not what this is. Then why does every article talk more about image than impact?" He leaned against his desk. "Because that's how it works. Publicity brings funding. Funding brings help. You know this." Grace met his gaze. "I know good intentions can get lost in the noise." For a moment, silence filled the space. Then Ethan sighed. "Grace, I get it. You want this to stay pure. But you can't change the world without the world noticing. Sometimes attention is the cost of progress." Grace nodded slowly, though something inside her remained unsettled. Later that week, she visited one of the kitchens on the south side. Kids laughed as volunteers handed out food, and a woman hugged her, tears in her eyes. "You don't know what this means to us," the woman said. Grace smiled gently. "I think I do." Moments like that grounded her the real reason she started all this. But when she returned to the office, the air felt different. Whispers, stares, the kind that prickled the back of your neck. By lunchtime, she found out why. A tabloid headline flashed across her phone. "Scandal at the Caldwell Foundation's sources question Grace Parker's background." Her stomach dropped. She clicked the article. It was filled with half-truths and speculation claims that she'd once been in debt, that she'd exploited her friendship with Henry Caldwell to climb the ranks, that she had no real qualifications. Grace's hands trembled as she scrolled. The article even showed a photo of her old apartment, calling it a far cry from the life she pretends to understand. She felt sick. The next few hours blurred. People avoided eye contact. The board requested an emergency meeting, and when Ethan finally called her in, he looked conflicted. "Grace," he began carefully, "this story's spreading fast. The board's worried." Grace crossed her arms. "Worried about what? That I'm not one of them?" "It's not like that," he said. "They just think we need to control the narrative. Maybe issue a statement. Step back from the spotlight for a while." She stared at him. "You mean hide? It's temporary." Grace's voice hardened. "Ethan, everything in that article is twisted, but none of it's false. I did struggle. I did live in that apartment. I did take care of your father when no one else would." "Why should I be ashamed of that?" Ethan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You're not the one who should be ashamed, Grace. But we both know how fast perception becomes reality. We can't risk losing donors over this." Grace's heart broke a little at his words. "Maybe you can't," she said quietly, "but I can't keep pretending this work is just about optics." Before he could respond, she turned and walked out. That night, she went back to the Southside kitchen. The volunteers greeted her warmly, pretending not to see the exhaustion in her eyes. Henry was there too, seated by the window, smiling as he watched a group of children eat. When he saw her, his smile faded. "I read it," he said softly. "That article." Grace sat beside him, the smell of soup and bread filling the air. "They make it sound like I don't belong here, like kindness needs a degree." Henry shook his head. "The world fears what it can't measure. They can't measure your heart, Grace, so they try to define it." Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought if I worked hard enough, I could prove myself, but maybe I was just fooling myself." Henry took her hand. "Don't mistake noise for truth. You changed lives. That's not something they can take away." Grace squeezed his hand, her voice trembling. "Then why does it still hurt because you care?" Henry said gently, "And caring always hurts." Later, as she walked home through the quiet streets, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Ethan. "Meet me at the office tomorrow morning. There's something you should see." When she arrived, Ethan was waiting with a small folder on his desk. "We did some digging," he said. "Turns out the story came from one of the PR firms the board hired. They leaked it." Grace's jaw tightened. "To get rid of me." Ethan nodded. "They think the foundation's image should stay cleaner." Grace's voice dropped. "Cleaner than the truth." Ethan sighed. "I've called an emergency board meeting. I'm backing you, but you should know it might cost me my position too." Grace looked at him for a long moment. "Why risk that?" "Because my father's right about one thing," he said quietly. "You changed this place, and maybe it's time I start acting like it." The meeting was tense. Some board members defended Grace, others didn't. When it was over, Ethan stood, his voice calm but resolute. "If we punish someone for honesty, then this foundation stands for nothing," he said. "Grace Parker stays, or I go." Silence followed. No one dared to challenge him. When Grace walked out of that room later, she felt lighter but also changed. That night, as she and Henry shared dinner at her apartment, he smiled across the table. "You see, Grace, the truth doesn't need protection. It just needs courage." Grace smiled back, the weariness softening into peace. "Maybe that's what this was all for, to remind me why I started." The next few weeks were strangely quiet at the Caldwell Foundation. Too quiet. After the scandal and the boardroom confrontation, everything seemed to return to normal on the surface, but Grace could feel the cracks beneath. The media noise faded, but whispers remained. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, while others acted overly polite, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. Grace buried herself in work, determined to prove she belonged not through headlines, but through results. Her community kitchen initiative kept expanding, but with growth came strained supply shortages, overwhelmed staff, funding delays. She stayed up late most nights, her kitchen light glowing long after midnight. Henry noticed the change. One evening, he dropped by her apartment with a pot of chicken soup and that same knowing look in his eyes. "You're burning both ends again," he said gently, setting the pot on the counter. Grace sighed, rubbing her temples. "If I stop now, everything falls apart. These people need us. Henry, they need you alive, too." She smiled faintly, exhausted. "I'll sleep when the work's done." Henry shook his head. "The work's never done. Grace, that's the trick of it." Later that night, when she finally sat down with her bowl of soup, Grace stared out her window at the city lights and thought about Ethan. He had kept his word. He defended her, took the fallout, and faced the board's cold stares for weeks. Yet, Something between them had changed. Their conversations had grown shorter, more formal. He seemed distracted, weighed down by something unsaid. That changed one Friday afternoon. Ethan called her into his office. His tone was serious but kind. "Grace, close the door." She did, bracing herself. "There's been a development," he said. "The board voted to restructure the foundation. They're cutting programs starting with community outreach." Grace froze. "Cutting. But the kitchens are thriving. They're helping more people than ever." "I know," Ethan said quietly. "But the board thinks we're overextended. They want to focus on strategic partnerships, whatever that means." Grace's voice trembled. "So, less feeding people, more photo ops?" Ethan's silence confirmed it. "I fought them," he said softly. "But my vote isn't enough anymore." Grace's heart pounded. "Then let me fight too. Let me show them why this matters." He looked at her, eyes full of regret. "Grace, they're not listening to reason. They've already made up their minds." Her breath caught. "You're telling me months of work, people's lives can just be erased because it doesn't fit a spreadsheet?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "I'm telling you the world doesn't always reward the right things." Grace's voice hardened. "Then maybe it's the wrong world." The meeting ended with a silence that said more than words could. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She paced her small apartment, replaying every decision she'd made since that rainy night she met Henry. Every risk, every fight, every small victory. She thought of the woman who had hugged her in the Southside kitchen, the little boy who'd said, "Miss Grace, this tastes like home," the volunteers who worked double shifts because they believed in what they were doing. She couldn't let them down. The next morning, Grace showed up at the foundation early before sunrise. She drafted letters, made phone calls, reached out to local churches, small businesses, and volunteers. If the foundation wouldn't fund them, maybe the community would. When Ethan walked in later, coffee in hand, he froze at the sight of her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Saving what we built," she said calmly. "With or without their approval. Grace, you can't go against the board. Watch me." He set down his coffee, frustration flashing in his eyes. "You're risking your job." "And what's yours worth?" she shot back. "If you stay quiet while they dismantle everything your father stood for." Ethan blinked, taken aback. Grace immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone, but not the truth behind it. He turned away, voice low. "You think I don't care? I think you're scared," she said softly. "And I get it. But fear doesn't build anything. It only preserves what's dying." They stood in silence for a long moment before Ethan finally spoke again. "What if we lose everything?" Grace looked at him steadily. "Then at least we'll lose it doing the right thing." By noon, word of her defiance had spread. Half the staff quietly offered to help. Others warned her to stop before she got fired. She didn't care. That afternoon, she hosted an emergency meeting at one of the kitchens. Dozens of volunteers showed up, bringing food, supplies, and even handwritten checks. Local reporters caught wind of it and arrived with cameras. When the story aired that night, it wasn't about the Caldwell Foundation. It was about the people. "Community rises to save its own." The headline read. Ethan watched the broadcast alone in his office, the city glowing behind him. Grace's voice played through the speakers. "Sometimes help doesn't come from the top down. Sometimes it starts with the person standing right beside you." He smiled faintly, pride and admiration softening his features. Then he picked up his phone. "Tell the board," he said to his assistant. "We're reinstating the outreach program. Effective immediately. The assistant hesitated. They'll fight it. Then they can fire me, he said simply. The next morning, Grace arrived to find Ethan waiting in the lobby. He handed her a folded newspaper. On the front page was her photo smiling beside volunteers, ladling soup for children. Underneath, the headline read, Grace Parker's movement sparks new wave of community action. She looked up at him, stunned. You did this. He shook his head. You did. I just caught up. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, Thank you. For what? For believing again. As they stood there in the sunlight streaming through the lobby windows, Grace realized something. True change didn't come from titles or wealth. It came from courage, from doing what was right when no one was watching. And maybe, just maybe, it had started with one woman sharing a meal with a lonely old man on a rainy night. The following months brought calm, at least on the surface. The Caldwell Foundation stabilized, the kitchens continued to grow, and the public began to see the organization in a new light. Grace's leadership had become the heart of it all. Wherever she went, people greeted her by name. Children ran to hug her. Volunteers smiled like family. But behind the scenes, a quiet ache began to take root. Grace and Ethan worked together nearly every day, yet they spoke less and less about anything beyond logistics. Their partnership, once full of energy and trust, had become formal again. Grace didn't know how it happened. Maybe after all the fighting, both of them were just tired. One evening, as the staff cleared out, Grace was finishing reports in her office when Ethan appeared at the door. His sleeves were rolled up, tie loose, eyes shadowed with fatigue. You're still here, he said. So are you. He smiled faintly. Touché. He stepped inside and leaned against the wall. For a moment, they just listened to the hum of the city beyond the windows. You did something remarkable, Grace, he said finally. You turned the worst moment in this foundation's history into a rebirth. I should have said that sooner. Grace set down her pen. You already did by standing with me when it mattered. Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, something that made Grace's chest tighten. Ethan looked away first. My father's been asking about you, he said. He's been bragging to everyone at his retirement community that you're the real boss here. Grace laughed softly. That sounds like him. He wants to see you, Ethan added. He says dinner's on him this time. She smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. Tell him I'll hold him to that. Ethan lingered, as if there was more he wanted to say. But after a pause, he nodded and left. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She thought about the way Ethan's eyes had softened when he looked at her, the way his voice always grew quiet when they spoke alone. There was something fragile there, something neither of them dared to name. Weeks passed. The foundation's success continued to draw attention. A major tech investor offered a massive donation, but with strings-attached branding rights, control over programs, and a glossy marketing campaign that would turn the kitchens into an influencer-friendly charity. Grace hated it instantly. This isn't a business, she said during a strategy meeting. It's a lifeline. If we sell that, we lose everything that makes it real. Ethan listened silently. The board leaned toward the investor's proposal. After all, the money could double their reach. Grace, one of the board members said gently, sometimes you have to compromise to grow. She shook her head. Not like this. After the meeting, she stormed out, frustration burning in her chest. Ethan followed her into the hallway. Grace, wait. She turned, her eyes sharp. You're not seriously considering this, are you? He sighed. It's not that simple. With that funding, we could help thousands more. Isn't that what we're here for?" "At what cost?" she asked quietly. "If you turn compassion into a product, it stops being compassion." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "You always make it sound so black and white, because sometimes it is." The tension between them hung heavy. Grace wanted to believe he understood, but the look in his eyes told her he was torn. That night, she visited Henry. He was sitting on his porch, a blanket over his knees, watching the sunset. "You look like someone carrying two worlds on her shoulders," he said. Grace sighed. "Ethan's considering a deal that could change everything. More money, more power, but it feels wrong." Henry nodded slowly. "He's like his mother that way, always trying to fix the world faster than it wants to change." Grace smiled sadly. "And me, you," Henry said. "Remind me of the reason she tried in the first place." Grace sat beside him in silence, letting his words settle. The next morning, Ethan called her into his office again. His expression was unreadable. "I turned it down," he said simply. Grace blinked. "The investor deal?" He nodded. "You were right. I almost forgot why we started this. I don't want to build something that looks good. I want something that is good." Relief flooded through her. "You did the right thing." He gave a small smile. "You make it sound easy." "It's never easy," she said softly. "But it's worth it." They shared a quiet moment, the air between them warm again, almost peaceful. But peace didn't last long. A week later, Grace received an anonymous letter at her office. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed neatly. "You don't belong here. People like you will always be the help, not the head." Grace's hands trembled. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her place, but this one hit differently. The words burrowed deep, stirring old wounds. When Ethan found her sitting alone later, the letter still in her hand, his face hardened. "Who sent that I don't know?" she whispered. "Does it matter? Yes, it does." He took the letter from her, reading it once, his jaw tightening. "This ends now. No one talks to you like this under my watch." Grace shook her head. "Ethan, it's not worth—" "It is," he interrupted, "because you've earned every inch of this place." She looked at him, her throat tight. "Why do you care so much?" He paused, meeting her eyes. "Because you remind me what I'm supposed to care about." The silence that followed was thick, charged with things unsaid. Grace wanted to speak, but her voice wouldn't come. In that moment, something shifted between them, something fragile, but real. A connection built on respect, and maybe something deeper, something both were too careful to name. That night, Grace wrote in her journal before bed, "I've spent my life thinking love was something that came with promises or plans. But maybe it's simpler, just two people standing on the same side of a fight." Outside her window, the city lights shimmered, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she wasn't fighting alone anymore. The rain came back to Maplewood the same way it had years ago, the kind that fell in long, cold sheets, washing the city in silver and memory. Grace watched it from her office window, coffee cooling in her hand. She had always loved rain, but lately it carried a strange heaviness. Everything seemed to be going well, at least on paper. Donations were steady, the kitchens were thriving, and Ethan had begun opening smaller outreach centers across nearby towns. Yet something about the past few weeks had felt off, like the quiet before a storm. It started with missing funds, small discrepancies in expense reports, a few $1,000s here and there. Then came delayed shipments, canceled volunteer schedules, and strange phone calls from donors asking about programs Grace had never approved. At first, she thought it was a clerical mistake. But when the third food supplier called to say their invoices had been redirected to a new account, she knew it was something more. That afternoon, she walked straight into Ethan's office, soaked from the rain, files clutched to her chest. "We've got a problem," she said. Ethan looked up from his laptop. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that doesn't go away with an apology," she replied, dropping the files onto his desk. "Money's missing. Not a lot, but enough to notice. And someone's rerouting supply payments through a dummy account." Ethan's brows furrowed as he flipped through the papers. "Who has access to this system?" "Only finance and us." He glanced up, worry flickering behind his calm. "You think someone inside's doing this?" Grace nodded. "Or someone wants it to look like we are." The following days were chaos. Ethan called for an internal audit. Whispers spread like wildfire. Grace felt eyes on her everywhere she went. Some staff avoided her entirely. Others offered hollow smiles that didn't reach their eyes. By the end of the week, the board convened an emergency meeting. Grace sat beside Ethan, heart pounding, as the chairman spoke. "Preliminary results suggest the transactions were authorized under Ms. Parker's credentials." Grace froze. "That's impossible." The chairman folded his hands. "We traced the logins. They came from your account." Ethan's voice cut in, sharp. "That doesn't make sense." Grace wouldn't, but the chairman interrupted. "Intentional or not, this compromises our integrity. We need answers." Grace looked around the table, disbelief washing over her. The same people who had applauded her months ago now stared with suspicion. "I've been here every night working," she said, her voice trembling. "If someone used my credentials, they hacked the system. You know me. You know what this foundation means to me." Silence. Ethan's jaw tightened. "We'll investigate properly. No one's making assumptions." But Grace could already feel it. The shift in the room, the doubt that lingered like a shadow. After the meeting, she stood alone in the rain outside the building. The glass walls reflected her blurred silhouette back at her, tired, wet, and suddenly small. Ethan joined her, umbrella in hand. "Come inside," he said softly. "I can't," she whispered. "Not right now." He looked at her with that same quiet worry she'd seen before. "Grace, we'll fix this. I promise." She shook her head. "You can't promise what you can't control." Her voice broke on the last word. And for a moment, Ethan looked like he wanted to reach for her, to bridge the distance between them, but he didn't. That night, Grace went to see Henry. He opened the door, concern etched across his face before she even spoke. "They think I stole from the foundation," she said, her voice hollow. Henry's eyes softened. "No, they don't. The ones who matter don't. But it feels like everyone does," she whispered. He guided her inside, poured her tea, and let her sit in silence until her hands stopped shaking. "Grace," he said finally, "storms don't come to destroy what's strong. They come to reveal it. You've faced worse than this." Grace stared into her cup, tears welling. "I just don't understand why this keeps happening. Every time things start to feel steady, something pulls me back under." Henry leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Because the world needs people like you tested. If it were easy, the wrong people would do it." His words stayed with her long after she went home. The next morning, she arrived at the office early again. Her instincts told her to look deeper to trace the system logs herself. She wasn't a tech expert, but years of hustling through problems had taught her how to follow patterns. By noon, she founded a secondary access point tied to a board member's credentials, Graham Willis, one of the same men who'd opposed her since the start. Her pulse quickened. She copied the files and brought them straight to Ethan. When he saw the evidence, his expression hardened. He's been rerouting donations into a private shell company. Grace nodded. And he used my login as cover. Ethan stood, fury flashing in his eyes. He's finished. That afternoon, Ethan confronted the board with the evidence. The meeting was brutal. Graham tried to deny it at first, but when Ethan presented the transaction trail, the truth was undeniable. The board expelled him immediately, though they did so quietly, fearful of scandal. Afterward, Ethan found Grace in the break room. She sat alone, sipping cold coffee. "It's over," he said softly. "They know it wasn't you." Grace looked up, relief and exhaustion washing over her face. "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that." He sat beside her. "You never should have had to prove it." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt lighter again, though something unspoken lingered beneath it, a closeness that went beyond gratitude. "Finally," Ethan said, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For letting you face it alone. I should have done more to protect you." Grace smiled faintly. "You did enough. You believed me when no one else did." He looked at her, his voice quiet. That wasn't belief. That was knowing. Her breath caught at his words. For a brief second, she thought he might say something more, but instead, he stood, offering a hand. "Come on, let's get out of here. My dad's been asking for dinner with both of us." Grace laughed softly. "He doesn't give up." "Does he never?" Ethan said, smiling. "Guess that's where I get it from." As they walked out into the rain, Grace realized something profound. The storm had come, and it had taken much from her peace. Trust, rest, but it had left behind something stronger, a truth she could finally feel in her bones. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was standing, and beside her, so was he. The following Saturday evening carried the smell of home cooking and warm laughter. Henry Caldwell's old townhouse in the quiet Maplewood district glowed from within. Soft jazz hummed through the air. The table neatly set for three. Grace stood in the doorway holding a bottle of wine she could barely afford, her palm slightly damp. Henry greeted her with a grin. "There's my girl. Come in, Grace. I told Ethan you'd try to be polite and bring something unnecessary." Grace laughed, stepping inside. "Well, I couldn't come empty-handed. Mama always said a guest should bring something besides an appetite." Ethan was already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, apron on something she'd never seen before. He looked different, relaxed, human. When their eyes met, a small, unspoken warmth passed between them. "Hey," he said softly, "you made it." "I wouldn't miss Henry's famous roast," Grace teased. "He's been talking about it all week." "Talking?" "Yes. Cooking." "Not so much," Henry said with mock offense as he lowered himself into his chair. "I'm the supervisor now. Ethan's the muscle." Ethan chuckled. "That's generous, considering I've already burned 2 trays of bread." Grace laughed, the sound bright and easy. For the first time in months, the tension she'd been carrying seemed to ease. They ate together like family passing dishes, teasing one another, sharing stories. Henry told tales of his younger days in New Orleans, of jazz nights and long road trips with his late wife. Grace listened, captivated, as he spoke of love that endured through hardship. "Your wife sounds like she was remarkable," Grace said softly. Henry's eyes grew distant, a faint smile on his lips. "She was. She used to say, 'You can't fix the world, Henry, but you can feed the people in it.' Guess that's why I took to you. Grace, you've got that same fire." Grace blinked back emotion. "That's the best compliment I've ever gotten." Ethan watched her quietly from across the table, admiration written all over his face. When she looked up, their eyes met again, and for a moment the rest of the world fell away. Later, after dinner. Henry excused himself to the living room to rest. Grace and Ethan stayed behind to clean up. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of lemon and garlic. Grace washed, Ethan dried. It was simple, domestic, and oddly intimate. Ethan broke the silence first. "My father's right, you know." Grace raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About you being the reason this place feels alive again." She smiled faintly. "He gives me too much credit." "No," Ethan said softly. "If anything, not enough." For a moment, the air shifted. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Grace tried to laugh it off. "Careful. Caldwell. You keep talking like that and I'll start expecting a raise." He smiled. "You deserve more than I could ever pay you." Their eyes met again, and this time she didn't look away. There was something raw in his expression, a mix of gratitude, respect, and something deeper he hadn't dared name. But before either of them could speak, Henry's voice floated in from the living room. "You two done flirting in there." Dessert's melting. Grace burst out laughing. Cheeks flushed. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, grinning sheepishly. They joined Henry on the couch with slices of pecan pie. He turned down the jazz and turned up the stories, weaving memories that made them both laugh and tear up. Grace found herself thinking how rare this kind of peace was. Three people who'd once been strangers, now sharing something that felt almost like home. After dessert, Grace helped Henry settle into his recliner. He looked at her with eyes that still sparkled beneath years of wisdom. "You know, Grace, I used to think life was about what you earn. But the older I get, the more I realize it's about who shows up when the rain falls." Grace took his hand gently. "You showed up for me first." He smiled. "Maybe, but you reminded me how to keep showing up." When Grace left later that night, Ethan offered to walk her to her car. The street was quiet except for the soft patter of rain on the pavement. "You were good for him," Ethan said quietly as they stopped by her car. "He's been happier since you came into our lives." Grace looked at him. "He was good for me, too." They stood there in the glow of the street lamp, rain misting the air around them. There was a softness in Ethan's eyes she hadn't seen before, something vulnerable, almost hesitant. "Grace," he began, his voice low, "there's something I've wanted to tell you." She felt her heartbeat quicken. "What is it?" He hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "Maybe another time." She smiled, a mix of relief and curiosity. "You always say that." He smiled back, faintly. "Yeah, I guess I do." They stood in silence for a few more seconds before she said, "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Grace." As she drove away, Ethan watched the taillights disappear into the rain. He stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, listening to the sound of the storm. Inside him, something had changed, something deep and quiet. Back at home, Grace hung her coat to dry and sat by her window, staring out at the rain. She thought about Henry's words. about love that fed people's souls, about showing up when the rain fell. And though neither of them had said it aloud, she could feel it now, the connection that had grown between her and Ethan. It wasn't a fairy tale or a spark born overnight. It was something steady, built through storms, trust, and shared scars. As the night deepened, she whispered softly to herself, maybe some families aren't found, they're made. Outside, the storm eased into a gentle drizzle, and the city lights shimmered like distant stars. Grace closed her eyes, letting the sound of rain lull her to sleep safe, seen, and no longer alone. The next morning dawned quietly over Maplewood. The air smelled of wet pavement and sunlight breaking through clouds. Grace woke up earlier than usual, her heart still light from the dinner at Henry's house. Well, for the first time in a long while, she'd felt a sense of peace that wasn't fleeting. She brewed a pot of coffee, humming softly as she looked through the morning mail piled on her small kitchen table. Most of it was the usual bills, charity newsletters, a thank you card from one of the families helped by the community kitchen. But one envelope stopped her cold. Her name was written in neat cursive handwriting she hadn't seen in years. The return address read, Atlanta, Georgia. Grace's hands trembled slightly. She didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Her mother. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at it. Then, slowly, she slid her finger under the seal. The letter inside was brief, almost formal. Grace, I heard about you on the news. You're doing good things. It seems. I'm proud of you. I'd like to see you if you're willing. I'll be in Maplewood next week. Love. Mama Grace set the letter down, her chest tightening. She hadn't spoken to her mother in nearly 10 years, not since the day she'd left home, with nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn dream of making life her own. The memories came rushing back, her mother's voice sharp with disappointment, the long nights of silence after arguments, the heavy words that still echoed. You'll regret walking away from your family. Grace. But she hadn't regretted it. Not really. At least, not until now, when her mother's handwriting stirred something fragile inside her. That evening, she found herself sitting at the Maplewood kitchen, staring absently at the volunteers moving around. Dana slid into the chair across from her, eyebrows raised. You look like you've seen a ghost. Grace gave a soft, humorless laugh. Maybe I have. Dana tilted her head. You gonna tell me or make me guess? Grace handed her the letter. Dana read it quickly, then looked up. Your mom. After all this time, Grace nodded, her voice low. Yeah. I don't even know what to say to her. Part of me wants to see her. The other part wants to run. Dana leaned forward. Grace, you've faced billionaires in boardrooms. I think you can handle one conversation with your mama. Grace smiled faintly. You make it sound easy. It's not, Dana said gently. But maybe it's time. That night, Grace called Henry to tell him. His voice was calm but thoughtful. Families are complicated, he said. But no matter how far you run, there's always a thread that pulls you back. Sometimes you just need to see what it's tied to. Grace sighed. What if she hasn't changed? Then at least you'll know you have. Henry replied. A few days later, Grace sat in the corner booth of the old diner where she used to work. She'd chosen it because it felt safe, familiar. The smell of coffee and fried eggs was grounding. At exactly noon, the door opened, and a woman stepped inside. Her mother looked smaller than she remembered, her hair now streaked with gray, her clothes neat but simple. She carried herself with quiet caution, scanning the room until her eyes met Grace's. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then her mother smiled hesitantly and approached the booth. "Grace," she said softly. "Mama." They sat across from each other, the silence thick but not entirely cold. "You look well," her mother said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Grace nodded. "You too." A waitress came and took their order's coffee for both. Nothing else. The silence returned. Finally, her mother spoke. "I've watched your interviews. The things you've done." I didn't expect. She stopped, swallowing hard. "I didn't expect you'd make it this far on your own." Grace gave a small, sad smile. "Neither did I. Some days." Her mother looked down. "I wasn't kind to you when you left. I thought I was protecting you from disappointment, but I was just protecting my pride." Grace said nothing. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," her mother continued, "but I'd like a chance to know you again, if you'll let me." Grace stared at her, heart heavy. The anger she'd carried for years suddenly felt tired, not gone, but softened by time. "I wanted you to believe in me," Grace said quietly. "Even when I didn't have much to show, I wanted you to say you were proud of me. Not because of what I did, but because I tried." Her mother's eyes glistened. "I should have. I see that now." Grace took a deep breath, feeling tears sting her eyes. "You hurt me, Mama. But I also know what it's like to be scared of losing someone. So maybe we can start small." Her mother reached across the table, tentative. "I'd like that very much." Grace hesitated, then placed her hand over her mother's. The touch was uncertain, trembling, but it was a beginning. When they parted later, her mother promised to call. Grace walked out into the afternoon sunlight, her heart both heavy and strangely light. That evening, she stopped by Henry's. He was sitting on the porch with a book in hand. "Well," he asked. Grace smiled faintly. "It went better than I thought. Worse than I hoped, but what's a start?" Henry nodded. "That's all a bridge needs, two sides willing to meet halfway." She sat beside him, resting her head on the porch railing. "It's strange. I thought seeing her would make me angry again. But instead, it made me realize how much I've changed. I'm not that scared girl anymore." Henry chuckled softly. "No, you're not. You're the woman who turned pain into purpose." Later that night, as Grace walked home, she called Ethan. He picked up after the first ring. "Hey," he said, his voice warm. "Everything okay?" Grace smiled softly. "Yeah, I just needed to hear a familiar voice." Ethan's tone softened. "How did it go with your mom?" Grace paused, looking up at the moon. It felt like standing in a room full of echoes, but for the first time, they didn't hurt. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm proud of you, Grace." Her throat tightened. "Thank you, Ethan." When she hung up, she stood on her balcony, watching the city lights shimmer. The rain clouds had drifted away, leaving the air clear and full of possibility. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Maybe healing doesn't come all at once. Maybe it's just one honest moment at a time." And for the first time in years, the past felt like a story she could finally put down. The following week began like any other, yet Grace felt something different in the air, an undercurrent of change. She couldn't name it, but it followed her everywhere. From the soft chatter of volunteers in the kitchen to the steady rhythm of her steps through the foundation's glass halls. For the first time in years, she felt lighter. The meeting with her mother hadn't erased the past, but it had loosened something inside her, untangling an old knot she hadn't realized was still there. It made her braver, more open to what might come next. That next arrived sooner than she expected. On Wednesday morning, Ethan called her into his office. He looked both excited and conflicted, which immediately set her on edge. "There's something I need to tell you," he began. "We got an offer, an invitation. Really. From the National Philanthropy Council." Grace frowned slightly. "The one in C." He nodded. "They want us to partner on a national initiative, expanding the community kitchen model across the country. It's a huge step forward." "Grace, they specifically mentioned you as the person they want leading it." Grace blinked, stunned. "Me, yes," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "They've seen the work you've done here. They want your vision, your approach, your voice." Her heart swelled with pride, and then immediately with fear. "That's incredible. But that would mean moving to C, wouldn't it?" Ethan nodded. "At least for a year, maybe more." The words hung in the air, heavier than she wanted them to be. Grace looked out the window, watching the rain gather on the glass. "It's a lot to think about." "I know," Ethan said quietly. "But you've earned this. No one deserves it more." There was sincerity in his tone, but something else, too, something sad. "I'll think about it," she said finally. He nodded, though his smile faltered. "Take your time." That night, Grace sat alone at her kitchen table, the letter of offer lying open before her. The official seal gleamed under the soft lamplight. It was everything she'd ever worked for: recognition, opportunity, a chance to make a difference on a larger scale. And yet, the thought of leaving Maplewood, leaving the people she'd grown to love, left her hollow. The next evening, she met Henry at his porch. He was sipping sweet tea, his favorite. "Decency." "Huh," he said after she told him. "That's a long way from here." Grace sighed. "It is. It's everything I thought I wanted. But I can't stop thinking about what I'd be leaving behind." Henry smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the biggest choices aren't between right and wrong, but between good and good." Grace laughed softly. "That's not helping." He chuckled. "Didn't say it would, but I'll tell you, this purpose doesn't live in one place. Grace, it lives in what you carry with you." She nodded, thoughtful. The following day, as Grace arrived at the foundation, she noticed something unusual. Ethan wasn't in his office. Hours passed, and still no sign of him. Late in the afternoon, she finally found him on the rooftop terrace, looking out over the city. "You're avoiding me," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "I just needed some air." "Ethan," she said softly, "you haven't told me what you think about all this." He hesitated. "What I think doesn't matter. It's your decision." She stepped closer. "That's not what I asked." He turned to face her, eyes full of emotion. "I think it's the right move. You've built something incredible here, and now you can share it with the world. You can help more people than ever." Grace searched his face. "And what about here? What about us?" He froze, caught off guard by the question. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city stretched around them, glowing under the sunset. "Finally," Ethan said, "you don't owe me your future." "Grace, if this is your next chapter, I'll be proud to see you take it." Her voice wavered. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," he said quietly. "But maybe love, whatever kind of love this is, means wanting someone to become who they're meant to be, even if it's not with you." Grace felt her throat tighten. "You think I'm going to leave?" Then he gave a small, sad smile. "I think you've always been destined for bigger things." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the lights flickering across Maplewood, thinking about all the lives intertwined with hers, the children at the kitchens, Dana's laughter, Henry's gentle wisdom, Ethan's quiet strength. The next morning, she visited the South Side kitchen. It was bustling as usual, full of laughter and warmth. One of the little girls she'd known since the start, Mia, ran up and threw her arms around her waist. "Miss Grace," Mia said, "Mama says you're going to help the whole country now. Is that true?" Grace froze. "Who told you that, Mr. Ethan?" "He came by this morning. He said you're going to make more kitchens for kids like me." Grace knelt down, meeting Mia's eyes. "Would you miss me if I left?" Mia thought for a moment, then said, "Yeah, but you'd still be helping." "Right. That's what you do." The simplicity of the child's words hit her harder than any speech ever could. That evening, Grace found Ethan in his office again, going over reports. She closed the door quietly behind her. "I made my decision," she said. He looked up, heart in his throat, and Grace smiled softly. "I'm staying." Ethan blinked, stunned. "Grace, are you sure?" "I thought about it," she said. "I realized I don't want to just build more kitchens. I want to build this one right here into something that lasts. Maplewood isn't done with me yet." Ethan exhaled slowly, a smile breaking through. "I don't know whether to thank you or call you crazy." "Both," she said with a laugh. He stood, stepping closer. "You know, the world might think you're turning down the chance of a lifetime." Grace looked at him, her expression calm and certain. "Maybe I'm choosing one instead." Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither looked away. The distance that had always hovered between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by something steady, quiet, and true. Later that night, Grace called Henry. When she told him her choice, he chuckled softly. "Knew it," he said. "Some roots aren't meant to be pulled up, they're meant to grow wider." Grace smiled. "You always have the right words, Henry." He laughed. "That's because I've made all the wrong choices first." As she hung up and looked out her window, the city lights shimmered like a promise. Grace had made her choice, not the easier one, not the louder one, but the truest. And for the first time, she wasn't just surviving or serving. She was home. The night it happened began quietly, too quietly for what was to come. Grace was at home, curled on her couch with a cup of chamomile tea and a blanket around her shoulders. She'd finally allowed herself to rest after weeks of decisions, emotions, and soul-searching. For once, her world felt still. She was even smiling when her phone rang. It was Dana. Her voice was shaking. "Grace, the South Side kitchen. It's on fire." Grace's heart stopped. "What? They think it started in the storage area. Everyone's out, but the fire's spreading fast. The firefighters are there." But Grace didn't hear the rest. She grabbed her coat and keys, running into the cold night air before Dana could say another word. When she arrived, the street was filled with flashing red and blue lights. Smoke billowed from the building, thick and angry, rising into the night sky. The smell of burning wood and plastic clawed at her lungs. Firefighters shouted orders as hoses sprayed water against the flames. Volunteers stood huddled on the sidewalk, some crying, others in shock. Grace spotted Dana near the crowd and rushed to her. "Is everyone safe?" Grace demanded, her voice raw. Dana nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Everyone's out, but the storage room's gone. Years of supplies, all the donations, everything." Grace turned toward the building. The sight hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a kitchen. It was the beating heart of Maplewood. the place where laughter and hope had lived. And now it was being swallowed whole by fire. Ethan arrived minutes later, still in his suit, his tie loosened, eyes wide with disbelief. "Grace," he breathed, finding her in the crowd. "Are you okay?" She nodded weakly. "Everyone's safe. But look at it." He turned, his jaw tightening. "We'll rebuild." Grace shook her head, her voice trembling. "You can't rebuild what's gone. Not like it was." "Then we'll build something better," Ethan said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed the pain behind it. Hours later, when the fire was finally contained, the firefighters let them step closer. The building stood half-collapsed, blackened and skeletal. The walls that once echoed with laughter were now silent. Grace stepped forward slowly, her boots crunching over wet ash. In the dim light, she saw something glint beneath the debris, an old photo, half-burned but still recognizable. It was of her, Henry, and Ethan at the grand reopening a year ago. She bent down, picking it up gently. The edges crumbled between her fingers. Behind her, Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Grace." She didn't turn around. "This place, it saved people. It saved me," he said softly. "Then it did its job." She looked up at him, eyes full of tears. "How can you be so calm?" "Because I have to be," he replied. "If I fall apart, who's going to help you stand?" The words cut through the smoke like a beam of light. Grace broke down then, silently, her shoulders shaking as Ethan pulled her into his arms. For a long while, neither spoke. Only the sound of water dripping from the hoses filled the night. 2 days later, the investigation confirmed what Grace already suspected. It had been an electrical fault in an old section of wiring. Not arson. It was nobody's fault. Yet it still felt like losing a friend. The following morning, Grace met Henry at his porch again. He was sitting quietly, his eyes soft with understanding as she approached. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I haven't," she admitted. "I keep seeing it. The fire, the smoke, all those memories burning." Henry nodded slowly. Loss has a way of echoing louder than joy, but it's the echoes that remind us what mattered. Grace sat beside him. "I don't even know where to start. The insurance will cover some of it, but not enough. The donors are already asking questions. The staff's scared." Henry smiled faintly. "You start where you always do with people." That night, Grace and Ethan gathered everyone at the community center next door. Volunteers, neighbors, families, everyone who had ever been touched by the kitchen's work came. Some brought food, others brought candles. They filled the room with light and warmth despite the devastation outside. Grace stood before them, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "I wish I had the right words," she began. "But all I can say is thank you for showing up, for believing in something bigger than any one of us. The fire took a building, but it didn't take what we built together. That still lives here." She placed a hand over her heart. "And I promise you, we will rebuild, not because of me or Ethan or anyone in charge, but because Maplewood deserves it, because no fire can burn away hope." The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. People hugged, cried, laughed through their tears. Ethan watched her from the side, pride and admiration lighting his face. After the meeting, he found her outside, standing in the cool night air. "You were incredible in there," he said quietly. Grace smiled tiredly. "I just said what I felt. That's what makes people listen," he replied. "You don't give speeches?" "Grace, You give them truth. They walked together toward the charred remains of the kitchen. Someone had placed flowers at the entrance, white lilies, soft against the blackened walls. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a handkerchief. I was going to give this to you when things calmed down, but maybe now's better. Grace frowned as she unwrapped it. Inside was a small silver key attached to a tag engraved with her name. What is this? She asked softly. Ethan smiled. The new lease? There's an empty warehouse 2 blocks down. Big windows, good structure, perfect for starting fresh. I signed it in your name. Grace stared at him, overwhelmed. Ethan, I don't thank me, he said. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Don't let the fire be the end of your story. Let it be the chapter that proves how strong you are. Grace felt tears blur her vision. She slipped the key into her palm, holding it tightly. I won't let it end here, she whispered, and she meant it. That night, back at her apartment, she placed the burned photo on her desk beside the silver key. The 2 objects once scarred, one new sat side by side, symbols of everything she'd lost and everything she still had to fight for. She wrote 3 words on a sticky note and placed it above them. Rise from this. When she turned off the lights, the faint moonlight caught the silver key, and it shimmered like hope reborn. Spring came early to Maplewood that year. The air was warmer. The streets smelled of wet earth and fresh paint. And in a once-empty warehouse 2 blocks from the ashes of the old kitchen, the sound of hammers and laughter filled the air again. Grace stood in the middle of the construction floor, wearing a hard hat that was slightly too big, a clipboard in her hand. Around her, volunteers and workers moved like clockwork, measuring walls, painting signs, setting up shelves. The new Maplewood kitchen was coming alive. She took a deep breath, letting the scent of new wood and fresh hope fill her lungs. This place wasn't just a rebuild, it was a resurrection. Dana walked up, holding 2 coffees. You're here before the crew again, she teased. Grace smiled. Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about where to put the community pantry and how to make the seating more open. Dana handed her a cup. You need to start thinking about rest. The grand reopening's in 3 weeks, and you look like you've been living on caffeine and adrenaline. Grace chuckled softly. Maybe I have. But look around. Dana, it's happening. Dana followed her gaze. The sunlight streamed through tall windows, lighting up the new mural painted on the far wall, a field of hands holding one another, in every shade of color. Above it, in bold letters, were the words, Together, we rise. Grace stared at it, her chest tightening with emotion. Ethan had it commissioned, she said quietly. He didn't even tell me. Yeah, Dana said, smiling knowingly. He's been here almost every night after you leave. You didn't know, Grace blinked in surprise. He has. Dana grinned. The man's got it bad for you. Grace, half the volunteers are already shipping you 2. Grace laughed, shaking her head. You're ridiculous. But when she turned toward the mural again, her heart fluttered. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived. He'd traded his usual suits for jeans and a gray t-shirt, sleeves rolled up, a streak of paint on his forearm. Grace couldn't help but notice how different he seemed these days, lighter, freer, as if he'd finally stepped out from behind the walls of his wealth. How's my project manager holding up? He teased. Grace crossed her arms. Depends. Are you the boss or the volunteer today? Today, he said, picking up a paintbrush. Just a guy who takes orders. She smiled, and for a while, they worked side by side, in easy silence. The smell of fresh paint and sawdust filled the air. Every brushstroke felt like healing. When the workers left for lunch, the space grew quiet again. Grace sat on an overturned crate, looking around at what they'd built. "You ever think," she said softly, "that maybe things have to fall apart so we can see what really matters?" Ethan sat beside her. "I think things fall apart so we remember we can rebuild them." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "You always know the right thing to say." He shrugged lightly. "Not always. Just when it comes to you." Grace's breath caught. The warmth between them wasn't loud or sudden, it was steady, built from months of shared battles, laughter, and quiet understanding. She looked down at her hands. "I don't know what this is, Ethan. I just know that since I met you, my life hasn't stopped changing." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. "Then maybe it's time you stop running from it." The moment hung between them like a held breath until the sound of footsteps broke it. Henry's familiar voice echoed from the doorway. "Now, don't let me interrupt whatever this is," he said, his tone playful. Grace turned, laughing. "Henry, you're supposed to be taking it easy." "Easy is for people who've run out of reasons to show up," Henry said, walking in with his cane. "And I've still got plenty of those." Ethan smiled. "You're just here for the grand tour, aren't you?" Henry's eyes twinkled. "And to make sure my favorite girl isn't working herself to death?" Grace grinned. "Too late for that." He looked around, his expression softening as he took in the space. "You've done it. Grace, you've built something that'll outlive all of us." Grace swallowed hard, emotion catching in her throat. "We've done it." That evening, after everyone had left, Grace stayed behind. She walked the length of the kitchen, running her fingers along the new counters, touching the freshly painted walls. Each step echoed softly, like a heartbeat returning to life. Then she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a small plaque bolted to the wall near the entrance. It read, "In memory of every meal shared, every kindness given, every soul restored, rebuilt by hearts unbroken. The Caldwell Foundation." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. She sank onto a bench, smiling through them. Ethan appeared quietly in the doorway. "You found it?" She nodded. "You really didn't have to do this." He walked toward her, sitting beside her. "Yes, I did. Because this place isn't just a building. It's proof of everything you've stood for. You didn't just rebuild the kitchen, Grace. You rebuilt people." She looked at him, eyes shining. "You make it sound like I'm some kind of hero." He smiled softly. "You are. Just the kind who doesn't need saving." She laughed lightly, shaking her head. "You really have changed. Ethan Caldwell." He tilted his head. "Maybe you're the reason why." They sat together in the golden light of evening, the new Maplewood kitchen glowing around them, a living testament to survival, love, and second chances. Outside, Henry's voice called faintly from the street. "You two planning on leaving before sunrise? Or should I bring a cot?" Grace laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. Ethan smiled, standing to help her up. "Come on," he said, offering his hand. "Dinner's on me. No arguments." She took his hand, holding it a second longer than necessary. "You sure you can afford me?" Ethan chuckled. "Grace, I couldn't afford to lose you." As they walked out into the soft glow of dusk, the lights of the new kitchen flickered on behind them, bathing the street in warm gold. And for the first time, Grace didn't just see a future, she felt it. The grand reopening of the Maplewood Community Kitchen arrived on a warm Saturday afternoon in early May. The sun poured through the wide glass windows, catching on the gleam of silver counters and colorful murals. Balloons fluttered in the breeze outside, and a line of people stretched down the block: families, neighbors, old volunteers, new ones, all waiting to step inside and see what had risen from the ashes. Grace stood by the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. She wore a soft blue dress that matched the color of the morning sky. Around her neck hung the silver key Ethan had given her months ago, now strung on a simple chain. It had become her quiet symbol of strength, of survival, of starting again. Henry was the first to greet her, cane in hand, wearing his favorite tweed jacket and a smile brighter than the sun. "Would you look at this?" he said, his eyes misty as he surveyed the crowd. "I've been to a lot of openings in my day, Grace, but this one feels like coming home." Grace smiled, squeezing his arm. "You are home, Henry?" He chuckled softly. "Then I guess I'll take seconds at the buffet." They laughed together, and the sound felt like music. Ethan appeared moments later, helping direct volunteers, greeting guests, and keeping the local reporters at bay. When he saw Grace, he stopped mid-sentence. For a brief second, everything around him seemed to fade: the noise, the people, even the flashing cameras. "You look," he started, then stopped, shaking his head with a smile. "You look like the day finally caught up with the person who deserved it." Grace blushed lightly. "You always did have a way with words." He grinned. "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation." Before she could reply, a small hand tugged at her dress. It was Mia, holding a paper flower she had made. "Miss Grace, I made this for the new kitchen." Grace knelt down, taking the flower gently. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." "Where should we put it?" Mia pointed proudly toward the big mural together. "We rise." Grace smiled. "Perfect spot." When the ribbon-cutting ceremony began, Ethan took the stage first. He spoke briefly, his words humble but full of pride. "This kitchen isn't just a building," he said to the crowd. "It's proof of what happens when people refuse to give up on each other. It's a reminder that second chances don't just rebuild walls, they rebuild hearts." He turned to Grace. "And none of this would exist without the woman standing next to me." The crowd erupted in applause. Grace felt her cheeks warm, but more than pride, she felt gratitude pure and deep. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath, her voice carrying steady across the courtyard. "When the fire happened," she began, "I thought we'd lost everything. But then the community showed up, the same people. We were here to help. You showed me something I'll never forget, that sometimes it's the broken things that hold the most light." She paused, glancing at Henry and Ethan, her eyes glistening. "We didn't rebuild this kitchen just to feed bodies. We rebuilt it to feed souls, to remind each other that kindness still works, and hope still lives here." The applause that followed was long and thunderous. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she cut the red ribbon, the silver scissors glinting in the sun. The crowd surged forward, laughter and music filling the air as the first meals were served. Inside, children ran from table to table. Volunteers passed out plates, and neighbors embraced. It was everything Grace had dreamed of and more. Later that evening, after the crowd began to thin and the last of the volunteers packed up, Grace found a quiet moment on the balcony above the new kitchen. She leaned against the railing, watching the sunset bathe Maplewood in golden rose. Ethan joined her quietly, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you might need this," he said. She smiled, taking it. "You know me too well." He leaned beside her, watching the sky. I've been thinking about what you said today about broken things holding light. Grace turned to him, her voice soft. What about it? He smiled faintly. I think people are like that too. You, me, my father, even this town. Maybe we're all just figuring out how to shine through the cracks. She nodded, emotions swelling in her chest. You've changed. Ethan, you used to look at the world like it was a problem to solve. Now you see it like a story to live. He met her eyes. You're the reason for that, Grace. There was no pretense in his tone, just quiet truth. Grace felt her breath catch. Ethan. He took her hand gently, not rushing, just holding it there, as if the world had finally slowed enough to let them both catch up. Grace Parker, he said softly, you came into my life, like a storm I didn't see coming, and you left it better than it was before. I don't know where this us goes from here, but I know I don't want to imagine a future without you in it. Tears welled in her eyes. You sure about that? Caldwell. You don't exactly do small town forever. He laughed quietly. Then I guess I'll just have to learn. She smiled, the kind that reached her soul. Then let's see where it goes. Down below. Henry called up to them from the courtyard, leaning on his cane. You two planning to stay up there all night? Or do I have to come drag you down for dessert? Ethan chuckled. Guess that's our cue. Grace squeezed his hand once before letting go. Let's go home. Ethan. They descended together, joining Henry and the others for one last meal at the long wooden tables inside the kitchen. The chatter and laughter filled the space again, just like it always had. At one point, Grace looked around the room, the families eating together, the volunteers joking, Henry smiling, Ethan laughing beside her, and she felt a warmth that words couldn't describe. She thought about everything it had taken to get here, the heartbreak, the doubt, the loss, and realized that every twist, every storm, had led her to this exact moment. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the lights dimmed, Grace stood alone in the center of the new kitchen. The air was quiet, the faint scent of cinnamon and fresh bread lingering. She placed her hand on the wall, right beneath the mural, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude. Thank you, she said softly to the place, to the people, to the life she'd built from ashes. Outside, the neon sign flickered to life. Maplewood Community Kitchen. Together, we rise. And for the first time, Grace didn't feel like a survivor. She felt like someone who had truly lived. The world had burned, but she had learned how to glow. And as the night settled over Maplewood, Grace Parker finally came full circle stronger, softer, and infinitely alive. In the noise of modern life, Grace Parker's story whispers a truth we often forget. The smallest act of kindness can heal the deepest wounds. Grace didn't have much. Yet, she gave what she could: time, warmth, and humanity. And in doing so, she reminded us that compassion is not weakness, it's power. Her journey from struggle to strength, from loss to love, teaches that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in the hearts we touch. Her story also speaks to the quiet courage of everyday people, those who choose to care even when it hurts, who keep showing up when life tests their faith. For older generations especially, Grace's path reminds us that it's never too late to forgive, to rebuild, or to start again. Life will always bring storms, but as Grace learned, storms don't come to destroy us. They come to reveal what's unbreakable within us. So take a moment today to reach out, to listen, to love a little deeper. You never know whose life or heart you might change, including your own. Thank you for being here, for feeling with us, and for believing in stories that heal. If Grace's journey moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. So together, we can keep spreading hope, kindness, and the beauty of second chances.